There is a specific moment that shows up in therapy rooms with an almost eerie consistency. Someone sits across from their clinician and begins to talk about cutting off all contact with their family. They lay out their reasoning in a calm, structured way, without the emotion that once surfaced so easily, without the tears that used to appear even when hearing about a stranger's pain. And the therapist notices something that doesn't quite match any category they were trained to recognize. This person isn't angry. They're not caught in the usual psychological conflict that often comes with family estrangement. They're not defensive. They're not filled with moral outrage. They are simply clear. When the therapist asks how they feel about the choice, there is a pause. Not hesitation, but reflection. The kind that suggests this question has already been explored many times, alone, in silence. And then they answer in a way that subtly changes the atmosphere in the room. They say they feel clear, not guilty, not grieving in the way they once expected, not divided between loyalty and self-protection, just clear. And the therapist writes something in their notes because this clinical presentation does not match the psychological literature they studied. This is not healing as it is supposed to appear. This is not the messy, complicated, emotionally turbulent process of individuation that most textbooks describe. This is something else entirely, something that everyone around this person finds deeply unsettling. And yet, for the first time in their life, this person feels genuinely whole. Carl Jung studied consciousness and transformation for decades. He observed thousands moving through their own psyche, integrating what they had split off, becoming fundamentally different people. His observations disturbed colleagues because what he documented contradicted comforting narratives about human growth. What he found was that genuine transformation is not always beautiful. It often leaves a person looking colder, more distant, and yet, paradoxically, more genuinely alive than before. This contradicted the redemption narrative that therapeutic culture had embraced. The idea that with enough self-awareness, you will emerge as a better, kinder version of yourself. But Jung's observation suggested something different. Sometimes the person who emerges from deep psychological work is less available, less accommodating, less willing to compromise their integrity for others' comfort. And this is not a sign of damage. It is a sign of genuine individuation. Today, I want to explore what Jung actually observed about a particular psychological phenomenon that the spiritual marketplace has severely misunderstood. The phenomenon of the awakened empath. Not the spiritual version of awakening, which tends to be romanticized, commercialized, and stripped of its psychological complexity, but the actual psychological transformation that occurs when a person with extraordinary sensitivity finally begins to question why they have it and what it has cost them. This transformation looks nothing like what the contemporary wellness industry promises, and that is precisely why it matters. To understand what an awakened empath becomes, you must first understand what they were before the awakening. And Jung did not romanticize this understanding. He looked directly at unawakened empaths without flinching from what he saw. What he found was not a gift, it was an adaptation. It was a survival mechanism that had been forged in the difficult heat of necessity, not bestowed by the universe or earned through spiritual advancement. The child who could perceive a shift in their parents' mood before a single word was spoken did not develop this sensitivity because they were old souls or spiritually advanced. They developed it because missing those shifts had consequences, real ones. The emotional climate at home could move from tolerable to overwhelming in an instant. And the child who learned to detect that threshold began to watch constantly, to adjust their behavior, to prepare for what might come next. Carl Jung described this pattern through what he called the wounded healer archetype, and his analysis of its formation was precise and uncompromising. The heightened sensitivity of the empath was not proof of spiritual advancement. It pointed instead to a childhood in which their own emotional needs were repeatedly overlooked, forcing their awareness outward. They became highly skilled at reading the inner states of others because no one had ever learned to read theirs. They learned to carry the emotional weight of those around them because the alternative felt like disconnection or loss. They developed an almost instinctive ability to anticipate what others needed because meeting those needs had become their primary source of value, their most reliable way to feel safe. This is the mechanism. This is the psychological truth that the spiritual marketplace has worked very hard to obscure. The spiritual wellness industry sells a different story entirely. It tells the sensitive person that their sensitivity is a divine gift, that they are old souls or light workers or chosen ones, that their capacity to feel everything places them on a higher rung of consciousness than the people around them, who seem to move through the world with protective numbness. This narrative is seductive precisely because it meets a desperate psychological need. For someone who has spent their entire life feeling broken, here at last is an explanation that transforms shame into distinction. The very quality that made them feel defective is reframed as evidence of their spiritual superiority. The pain that they have carried without understanding finally has meaning. But Jung would tell you that this narrative is the most dangerous thing an awakening empath can believe. And he would explain why, with the precision of a man who had watched this psychological pattern play out again and again. The narrative of the empath as spiritually evolved prevents the one process that could actually transform them. It prevents them from interrogating the wound itself. It keeps them trapped in the unconscious repetition of the original trauma, dressed now in the language of spirituality and purpose, but structurally identical to what came before. The unawakened empath who believes themselves to be spiritually gifted is still an unawakened empath. They are simply a person who has learned to feel noble about their suffering. Genuine empathic awakening does not begin with the embrace of sensitivity. It begins with something far more uncomfortable. It begins with questioning. These questions do not come from the spiritual community because they are not spiritual questions. They are psychological questions. They require looking directly at the mechanisms of one's own psyche without the buffer of noble narrative. Why do I feel responsible for other people's emotional states? What happened to me that convinced me my worth was determined by how much of other people's pain I could absorb into myself? When did I learn that my own needs were less important than everyone else's comfort? When did I become a person who apologizes for existing? When did I decide that my role in relationships would be to smooth over conflicts, to forgive everything, to never hold anyone accountable because holding them accountable would feel like betrayal? These questions lead somewhere that the spiritualized empath narrative cannot follow. They lead into the darkness of one's own psychology. And Jung observed that when someone begins asking these questions honestly, they enter a period of disillusionment so severe that it often resembles clinical depression. The person begins to see their relationships with clarity, and what they see is devastating. Not because everyone around them is overtly cruel or obviously toxic, but because the relational dynamics they have participated in for years are built on a foundation of such profound self-abandonment that there is almost nothing authentic left in the structure. They begin to recognize that what they have been living is a performance. the dependable one, the understanding one, the one who never has needs, the one who forgives everything and reframes cruelty as unhealed pain in others, the one who is always available, the one who never expresses anger, the one who gives and gives without visible resentment. And slowly, they come to see that this performance was never love. It was not compassion. It was not a sign of spiritual maturity. It was a trauma response, so deeply wired into their nervous system that they had mistaken it for who they are. This realization creates a profound internal rupture, because the role has become their only identity. The role and the self have fused together, and to question the role is to question the self. This is where many empaths stop, because what follows feels unbearable. What follows is the collapse of the helper identity. Carl Jung described this moment with striking clarity. The understanding that real transformation always demands that something within us must end before something new can begin. The helper dies when the empath finally accepts a truth that they have been running from for their entire life. They cannot heal anyone, not through their extraordinary sensitivity, not through their understanding, not through their willingness to absorb other people's darkness and carry it away. All those years of emotional absorption did not transform the pain that they carried. It simply relocated it. It moved from the other person's body into the empath's body. It settled into the empath's nervous system. It became chronic fatigue. It became mysterious illnesses that no doctor could explain. It became the depression that makes no sense on paper because the life looks fine from the outside. It became the constant background hum of anxiety that the empath learned to think of as normal. Jung called this shadow integration. For the empath, it means integrating the shadow side of compassion. The shadow of the helper is the need to be needed. The shadow of constant forgiveness is the inability to hold others accountable. The shadow of absorbing everyone's pain is avoiding your own. Until the empath confronts these shadows, their sensitivity remains a cage. The gift narrative keeps the cell door locked. What happens when the helper dies? This is where Jung's observations become genuinely uncomfortable, because the person who emerges does not look like what anyone expects. They do not become a more evolved version of the old empath. They do not become more radiant or more compassionate or more spiritually developed. They become something the old empath would have been terrified of. They become someone their family would not recognize. They become someone their longtime friends would struggle to understand. They become difficult. They become distant. They become boundaried in ways that feel cold to people who benefited from the empath's old availability. The first transformation is a shift towards psychological sovereignty. The awakened empath becomes ruthlessly selective about who receives their energy and time. The old empath was available to everyone endlessly. The awakened empath is available to almost no one. This is not bitterness or walls. It is someone who finally understands what their energy is worth. They have looked at where they spent it, what was created with it, how those people treated the gift. They have decided they will no longer waste what is finite on people who treat it as infinite. Jung recognized this as psychological health. The empath has stopped confusing self-sacrifice with love. Real love is mutual recognition between two people who've chosen to show up authentically. This realization ends many relationships, and that is precisely the point. The second transformation is equally difficult. The awakened empath develops capacity to say uncomfortable things. They hold others accountable without softening the truth. They sit in someone's displeasure without rushing to fix it. The old empath would have absorbed the tension immediately, apologized, explained their position to make the other person comfortable. The awakened empath allows the tension to remain. They understand that rushing to resolve it is often just another way of placing someone else's comfort above their own integrity. The urge to smooth everything over is not kindness. It is a conditioned response. Carl Jung found this especially revealing because it requires the integration of what he described as the aggressive shadow. Empaths often suppress any trace of aggression or fierceness. But Jung recognized something essential. A person who cannot access their own aggression is not truly at peace. They are simply conditioned. The awakened empath can be gentle, and they can also be firm. The difference is that these responses are no longer automatic. They are chosen based on what the situation genuinely requires. This marks the next transformation, a more detached, conscious perception. At this stage, the empath is able to perceive pain clearly without immediately stepping in. They begin to understand the distinction between recognizing suffering and being responsible for it. They see that the pain belongs to the person experiencing it. They can hold compassion without trying to rescue. Jung understood this as empathy evolving beyond codependence, a form of awareness that remains open but no longer entangled. The feeling no longer hijacks their behavior. The awakened empath becomes comfortable with being misunderstood. The old empath was terrified of this. They explained themselves endlessly to prevent misinterpretation. The awakened empath stops. They state their truth once and do not chase understanding. If someone interprets their boundaries as cruelty, they can tolerate it without crumbling. This means accepting that you cannot control how others perceive you. They do crave authentic relationship more deeply than before. But authentic relationship only happens with people who can see them clearly without management. Finding those people requires letting everyone else misunderstand you without trying to fix it. If this perspective resonates with you, take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what aspects of this transformation speak to your own experience, or if you find yourself questioning the empath narrative that the spiritual marketplace has sold you. The fifth transformation is the awakened empath becoming dangerous. Not violent or cruel, but dangerous because they see clearly. They perceive manipulation, identify narcissistic patterns, feel when words and energy don't match. This perceptual accuracy, combined with their willingness to act, makes them threatening to unhealthy systems. Families built on secrets, organizations built on dysfunction. The old empath was the perfect participant in these systems. They absorb toxicity without comment. The awakened empath sees the toxicity and either names it or removes themselves entirely. They become someone the dysfunctional system cannot afford to have in the room. Their clarity exposes what everyone else has agreed not to see. But here is the cost, Jung documented. The awakened empath is lonely in ways the old empath never was. They were surrounded by people that had a role, a function that others affirmed. The awakened empath has shed all of that. Fewer people, fewer obligations. Each remaining relationship is genuine, but the quantity has dropped. When you sit alone on a Saturday night, recognizing that the relationships you poured decades into are no longer part of your life, This feels less like liberation and more like exile. Jung did not pretend this was easy. The transition between the death of the old empath and stabilization of the new one is among the most painful psychological experiences a human can endure. You have released everything familiar. You have not yet built what comes next. You stand in an open field with nothing around you. Jung was critical of the spiritual marketplace's version of empathic awakening. They sell it as a beautiful butterfly transformation. But Jung saw something raw. He saw people grieving the loss of their own identity. He saw people recognizing that much of what they called love was actually just their trauma response. There is no beauty in this, if you are honest. Only the stark reality of transformation. The old self must die. The old relationships must end. The old narrative about who you are and why you exist must be abandoned. And you must find a way to survive the period in which everything has fallen away and nothing new has yet taken its place. You must learn to tolerate solitude. You must learn to be with yourself without the distraction of everyone else's crisis. You must learn to exist without the validation of being needed. And yet, Jung found that survivors of this transformation emerged with quiet power. Not dramatic visible power, not charisma or authority, something subtler and more resilient, something that cannot be taken away because it does not depend on others' perceptions. The power of someone who knows exactly who they are. Someone who knows clearly what they will accept and what they will not. Someone who no longer bargains with their own limits. Someone who has stopped apologizing for simply existing. Someone who has stopped reshaping themselves into whatever form makes everyone else comfortable. Someone who can sit in their own solitude without needing to fill it with other people's problems. Someone who can feel deeply without being overwhelmed by those feelings. Someone who can perceive what is happening without feeling obligated to act on every perception. Carl Jung described this as the individuated empath, an individual who has moved from unconscious sensitivity into conscious awareness. From automatic absorption to intentional choice. From performing empathy as a means of survival to embodying empathy as a source of strength. They still feel everything. They still notice what others miss. But now it serves them rather than consumes them. It guides their decisions instead of controlling their actions. The individuated empath is not more spiritually advanced than they were before. They are simply more conscious. They are more honest. They are less willing to compromise themselves for the comfort of others. They are more willing to face the reality of their own psychology without seeking refuge in noble narratives. They understand that they cannot heal anyone else because they finally understand themselves well enough to recognize the futility of that goal. They understand that their sensitivity is not a gift that obligates them to serve. It is a capacity that they can use or not use according to their own judgment. Most people prefer the old empath, the available one, the one who would sit with your pain without complaint, who would forgive anything, who would sacrifice their well-being to maintain yours. That empath was convenient, easy to be around. The awakened empath demands reciprocity, requires honesty, insists on being treated with care. These requirements feel like betrayal to people used to the old dynamic. They will say the empath has changed, become selfish, lost their compassion. Jung heard these accusations and recognized them. Not descriptions of the empath's decline, but descriptions of others' loss of access to an unregulated resource they had been exploiting. If you are in this transformation right now, if you are in the terrifying space between who you were and who you are becoming, if you have started to question the narrative of the empath is spiritually gifted, and you are beginning to see the wound underneath, if you have begun to withdraw your energy from people who have not earned it, if you are learning to say no, if you are discovering that you are uncomfortable with being misunderstood, and you are willing to tolerate that discomfort anyway, Jung would want you to know something that the spiritual marketplace will never tell you. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It is a sign that you're doing it at all. The loneliness is not evidence of failure. It is the natural consequence of outgrowing a life that was built to contain someone who no longer exists. The grief is real, and it is appropriate, because you are losing something. You are losing the person that everyone was comfortable with. You are losing the role that gave you identity. You are losing the relationships that were built on your self-abandonment. And that loss creates space for the person you actually are. Not the person you were trained to be. Not the person that everyone loved because you were useful, but the person who exists underneath all the performing, all the absorbing, all the rescuing, all the accommodating. What the awakened empath becomes is not prettier than who they were before. It is not more spiritual or more evolved. It is simply more real, more imperfect, more honest. Someone who can feel everything without being destroyed by it. Someone who can perceive without being obligated to fix. Someone who can love deeply without losing themselves. Jung believed this transformation was one of the most significant of the human consciousness could undergo. Not because empaths are special or chosen, but because it requires confronting every comfortable lie you have told yourself about who you are and why you exist. It requires dying to an identity that felt like home, even though it was a prison. And it requires discovering that underneath all the performing, all the absorbing, all the rescuing, there was always a person who deserved to exist. And that person is finally allowed to be. That is what the awakened empath becomes. Not a better version of the old self, but a completely different relationship with the self. One where sensitivity is a tool rather than a wound. Where perception is a choice rather than a compulsion. Where love is an offering rather than an obligation. Where boundaries are not walls, but rather the architecture of self-respect. The uncomfortable truth is that this transformation looks nothing like the awakening the spiritual marketplace promises. It is messier. It is lonelier. It demands more grief. It brings more endings. It can make you harder to be around because you are no longer playing the role that once made you convenient. It disrupts systems that relied on your unconscious patterns and your habit of abandoning yourself. It makes you real. And if you are moving through this transformation right now, even the painful parts, you are further along than you realize. You are not failing. You are not becoming cold or damaged. You are becoming conscious. You are integrating what you once split off. You are facing what you once denied. You are turning the wound into understanding. Carl Jung would describe this not as a collapse, but as a necessary transformation. It is not comfortable, but it is honest. And in the end, it is that honesty that begins to set you free.